Hi there, my name's Emmy Barker. I'm one of the medics here at Langford. I have an interest in infectious diseases. So what I'd like to do is take you through some information about Leishmaniosis in dogs. So it's in three parts. We're going to initially cover when these cases arise, what other infections are and why they're a problem for us. Part two is going to more specifically kind of start delving into what would make us suspicious about Leishmaniosis in dogs and what tests we'd be wanting to do for that. And then part three, we'll start talking about treatment of Leishmaniosis as well. What you'll also see on the screen behind me is a QR code. That is a link to our online information. It is a document that we regularly update as the information improves that's out there available to us. And we also have an online advice service that you can kind of submit requests to if you've got trickier cases that our online advice doesn't answer.
So one of the first questions that I think we need to answer is why? Why do I need to know about these non-endemic canine vector-borne diseases like Leishmaniosis, but also we're thinking ehrlichiosis, babesiosis, staphylococcus as well in dogs. And it's because dogs can acquire these infections from arthropod vectors. These arthropod vectors vary across the world, and the distribution of these vectored pathogens varies usually in association with those arthropod vectors. But then what happens is that the dogs that have been infected can also move around the world as well. They can be imported with their owners. They can be kind of imported into the country to be owned in this country. And as a consequence, we do get these infections coming into the UK. The first case of Leishmaniosis I saw was when I was a student many, many years ago. And that case was seen by Dr. Sushaw, who set up the Aquis laboratory, looking for the testing for these cases. And that laboratory is still going strong and is something that I'm very proud to work with. Now, the reason why it's important for us is that these arthropod vectored pathogens can be really pesky. So they often have a long latent period, a long subclinical state, and they can often be carried as well in dogs that have minimal to no clinical signs associated with them. But on the flip side of things, these infections can also cause very significant, potentially life-limiting clinical disease that often mimics our idiopathic immune-mediated disorders such as polyarthritis, glomerulonephritis, hemolytic anemias, and thrombocytopenias as well. And these clinical signs may develop months to sometimes years after that initial exposure. And the frustrating thing about them is that they often then also require very specific testing and very targeted testing, but also very specific and targeted treatment as well. So if we don't consider them as possibilities, we could very easily miss them. There's also the possibility for spread to non-travel pets, either with the same owner or for different owners. And with some of these infections, there's also a potential for zoonotic transmission. So I think it's really important that we do become aware of them, such that when we see them in practice, we are able to deal with them more appropriately. If we move on to when should we be considering testing for these non-endemic diseases, again, another interesting and potentially controversial question with that. On the least controversial side of things is when we have an unwell dog in front of us that has a history of travel, particularly if the clinical signs that we're seeing could be associated with the infections. And when we're talking about travel, this can come under many, many guises. So these can include dogs that have been rescued. They may have been rescued with or without known infection or known disease. They may have had previous testing performed, which may have been negative at the time. So again, it's worth being aware that things can change with that. It's also worth being aware that these dogs that are coming in may have variable levels of risk associated with them in terms of risk of infection. So they might have had excellent previous care. They may be coming in with known history. They may be coming in from countries that are relatively low risk in terms of the infections that we're thinking. Alternatively, they may have had a history of straying with minimal to no kind of prophylactic healthcare that could have reduced their risk. So again, we have to just be really mindful that these are very variable in terms of their risk levels. We may also have animals coming in with owners, so immigrating into the UK. Again, they might have had a known history of infection, they might not. Or we have private puppy sales. So they will have been imported, but they will have been, he spent a really small amount of time within the country of origin, so that window of transmission is going to be relatively narrow. It's not an absent window, but we just have to think that some of these are going to be relatively relative. In terms of other cases to consider testing, so what about the unwell dogs that have no travel history? So these can be really, really challenging. So you have the ones, and for me, they tend to fit into a couple of different categories. So we have the ones that have kind of access to travel dogs. So it could be that their parents were imported or had a history of travel. It could be that they live with dogs that have had a history of travel or lived with them. So historically. We might also have cases that are breeding animals, whether that breeding has been successful or not. They've clearly would have had very close contact with another dog or dogs. And it's worth remembering that some of these animals will now be neutered, but at the time of contact they might not have been. We also have to consider cases where their life history is incomplete, so animals that have been rescued from a rescue shelter, for example, or a friend of the family where the friendship might be a bit more kind of nebulous, as it were. So these are going to be things to consider. Now, particularly we want to consider ones where the clinical signs could fit very closely with the infectious diseases we're considering testing for. They tend to be more challenging to consider because they will be often mimicking some of our immune-mediated diseases or some of our neoplastic processes. But we do have to just bear them in mind because we know that there has been transmission in the UK of some of these infections that we often consider to be non-endemic. Another controversial one to consider testing is what do we do with a well dog that has a history of travel, or a well dog that has a history of exposure to a dog with a known infection, a known imported pathogen. And these are a bit tricky to kind of manage. Now, I'm very much in the camp that would like to know if they've got an infection on board, such that we're able to then monitor those dogs and make sure that we're able to catch any complications associated with that infection early. But we also appreciate that for some of those clients that represents an expense that they may not feel that they want to pay for. It's something that may not necessarily or often isn't covered by the insurance because you're not going after a particular disease itself. But again, I would rather know if I have a case in front of me that has the potential for a zoonotic infection, that has the potential for a life-limiting disease process that might be better monitored or managed for, or if you've got a case where you don't really want to fall in love with something that ultimately might have a life-limiting disease. So if we're going to focus a bit more on leishmaniosis, it's the most frequently encountered non-endemic canine vector-borne disease that we see in the UK. It's certainly the one that we receive the most frequent advice requests about from our non-endemic disease processes point of view, even though we provide very extensive notes on it. It's caused by infection with the Leishmania species protozoal parasite. In the UK, this is most frequently Leishmania infantum, which is endemic to the Mediterranean basin area. In other areas of the world, there are other species of Leishmania that tend to be involved instead. It's transmitted by the phlebotomous species sandflies, and it's one of those ones where they're most likely to be bitten around dawn or dusk time around those areas where they most frequently see it. And dogs are a reservoir of disease. They're sentinel animals to have it. And we can then also see that transmission to humans as well. So it is a zoonotic disease process, but to date, there's been no dog-to-human transmission reported in the absence of the sandfly vector. And I think this is really, really important. So we know that we can get dog-to-dog transmission. We don't really know how it is transmitted dog-to-dog, whether it's close contact, whether there's some way that they're mechanically rubbing the infections into each other, whether it is another vector like a flea or a tick that we're just not aware of. But we do have to be really quite careful with that. There there have been cases of vertical transmission, so infected bitches through to their offspring, so we do have to be careful from that point of view. It's also possible to get venereal transmission as well, so again we have to be really careful if we're thinking about these dogs in terms of who they've mated with, and in people at least, it's possible to transmit infection iatrogenically through blood products, but the transmission rate is going to be really quite low for those. And most of the time when we see it, dog-to-dog transmission in the UK, it's horizontal between dogs in the same environment that are living together or spending a lot of time together, such as in doggy daycare.
So thank you for listening to part 1. As we said before, we've got our QR code, which has a lot of that information on there as well. There's lots of other resources online too, so just reach out if you need access to those. Otherwise, please feel free in your leisure to progress to part 2.